believe that we can and that we must restore integrity in government and the confidence of people in the integrity of their government. Because of this administration being 20 years of age and all of these weaknesses developing in it at this particular time, I believe it's apparent to the average person that they do not have the resiliency to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do that thing.
Earl Warren was, I would argue, probably the second most important Supreme Court justice behind John Marshall in American history. He was, had an illustrious political career. He was governor of California, actually the first one to be elected 3 times. Was a vice presidential nominee in 1948 for the Republican Party. Had an extraordinary career. He was born in Los Angeles, and he came to Bakersfield. I'm not exactly sure about why. We know very famously that his father was killed here in Bakersfield, and it was unresolved, which is very interesting because it's not a coincidence probably that he went to Berkeley Law School and went into law enforcement. He was a district attorney, he was a prosecutor, and a lot of the ideas and a lot of the things that he did as a prosecutor, he later revisited when he was on the Supreme Court. So really there is a kind of a link between his childhood and his interest in law enforcement and the judiciary. He was considered to be a moderate Republican. He was, because of a quirk in the way that Californians elected their governor, he was actually elected as governor with 90% of the vote, which nowadays we can't even imagine that. And so he was not considered to be particularly ideological. By today's standards, he would definitely be considered to be a moderate. In 1948, he was suggested as the vice presidential running mate. And in 1952, back before we had the primary system that we have today, oftentimes states, especially large states, would offer up their favorite sons. And in 1952, he was offered up as a favorite son for the Republican nomination, even though everybody knew he wasn't going to get it. Nixon was an Eisenhower man, which was a good thing since he eventually became his vice president. So by 1952, he was definitely playing the game of national politics. Eisenhower very briefly appointed him as the Solicitor General, which we all know is essentially the position nowadays that argues cases in front of the Supreme Court. And very shortly afterwards, the Chief Justice passed away, and he put Earl Warren onto the court. Brown versus the Board of Education was in 1954, and that was one of, if not the first case that Earl Warren listened to. As a matter of fact, they had to do oral argument more than once so that he could listen to it live. To give you a sense of the kind of judge that he was, it was very important to him that if you were going to have a decision as important as Brown versus the Board of Education, if we were going to tell the South that we were going to end Jim Crow segregation, he wanted to make sure, to the best of his abilities, that he had a 9-0 decision. That's almost a political view, that we want to make sure that politically it's palatable to the country. And it's interesting because when we look at judges nowadays, most judges, actually 8 out of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court today, are judges. That's what they were before they were on the Supreme Court, was that they were judges. Back in the 1950s and in the 1960s, judges like Hugo Black, Earl Warren, these were men who had national reputations before they became judges. They had political backgrounds, not just legal backgrounds. And so when you have Earl Warren wanting to fashion a 9-0 decision because it was going to be a sweeping national decision, that tells you the kind of character, the kind of mindset he had when he was going about his business on the court. Miranda versus Arizona, of course, is except for Brown, perhaps the most famous decision of all. A lot of people are somewhat hesitant in their praise of Earl Warren, because the way that Earl Warren approached judging oftentimes was he would back into it. He knew the result that he wanted, and oftentimes he would, kind of explain to his law clerks, this is the result I want, and let's figure out a part of the Constitution that justifies it, which drives conservatives today absolutely crazy, because they would say you need to look at the Constitution first and then decide what the outcome is. But in Miranda versus Arizona, this was, I think, a very large effort to augment the rights of those who were not aware of their Fifth Amendment right of protecting themselves against self-incrimination. So Miranda versus Arizona, which was, even in its day, a very controversial decision. It was a 5-4 decision, and the worry then is the same concern that a lot of people have now, which is that you're going to essentially be handcuffing law enforcement, that when people get arrested, they're not going to talk. And yet, just a few years ago, the Supreme Court revisited this issue, and even a conservative like Rehnquist said that, you know what, this is now woven into the fabric of our jurisprudence, and even though it might not have been decided in the way that I would have decided it, this is an important part of our civil liberties in this country. The largest criticism of the Warren Court was that it was activist. He essentially transformed the Supreme Court from a legal institution to a political one. And oftentimes he wouldn't use the Constitution as his guide. He would use his own political opinions as the way of guiding what the legal outcome ought to be. The largest criticism as well is that some of the decisions, although they were probably the right outcome, the legal reasoning, the jurisprudence, if you will, was not necessarily top-notch, and that made it more difficult for later courts and later decisions to be made. Anybody who has studied this knows that one of his most controversial decisions was Engel versus Vitale, where he told the state of New York that they cannot have compulsory prayer every morning. And I remember that studying that decision upset a lot of people. And John F. Kennedy famously said, well, the solution to that is to pray more at home. So the Warren Court, while it was, Earl Warren was somebody who definitely looked at all sides of the issue, he definitely had a point of view, and he was never afraid to get out ahead of public opinion in making some of those decisions. I think that what we've learned from Earl Warren is the importance of the Supreme Court as an institution for fostering social change. It's interesting, when you look at the early court, the power of judicial review is not even in Article 3 of the Constitution. It was hinted at in the Federalist Papers, but it's not even in the actual Constitution. And yet, when we go from that reality to the fact that you had presidents like Thomas Jefferson, who in his heart probably did not believe in the judiciary as a co-equal branch of government, and you juxtapose that to the Supreme Court today, I think a lot of the power of the Supreme Court today, we can trace that back to the efforts of Earl Warren. Virtually every single major issue in America today, whether or not we're talking about the Affordable Care Act of President Obama, or we're talking about social issues like gay marriage, or we're talking about affirmative action, or we're talking about civil procedure, or we're talking about due process rights for those accused of crimes and taking DNA swabs, to this day, many of the biggest issues, the most divisive issues that we face as a country, that legacy, for better or worse, I think can oftentimes be attributed to the efforts of Earl Warren in the 1950s and 60s.
Today we're in the Bakersfield High School archives, and we teach a class here at Bakersfield High School that keeps control of the history of the school. And we have quite a few things that are pretty interesting in the collection, including we found a book in the attic of the school that, as it turns out, as the kids started flipping through it, it actually contains the grades of Chief Justice Earl Warren when he was a student here from 1904 to 1908. So this is a handwritten book that would be kept by the registrar at that time, and it has his freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year. And across the top it has the classes that he took. So as my students look at Earl Warren's there's a couple of things that stand out to them. His freshman year, his algebra grades, 69, 68, and then the third quarter he got a 41%. And then he gets a 94%. The kids are wondering what conversation took place in the Warren household to get him from a 41% to a 94% in algebra. That's fairly impressive. We also know that his grades, he has two classes his freshman and sophomore year in Latin. And the highest grade he gets is the first quarter of his sophomore year. He gets an 86%, and then it starts to drop off, and then his fourth quarter at 71%. And when I talked to Earl Warren Jr., he told me his father just hated Latin and would use the expression, "It's all Greek to me," as an expression meaning he didn't understand it. And none of his rulings as a Chief Justice contain any Latin phrases. And now we know that Latin was definitely not his strong point. His U.S. history classes, his senior year, were all mid 90%, 93, 93, 92, and 94. Very strong classes. Physics, not so much. This is the Oracle for the fall of 1907. Today it's a yearbook. Back then it was like a literary magazine, and was put out about every 6 to 7 weeks. We find Earl Warren mentioned under the junior-senior class as participating on October 7th, where he had a debate that he participated in. The question was, resolved that it is not for the best interest of Bakersfield and Kern County to consolidate. And his group, his partner, Warren Stockton and Earl Warren, won the affirmative. But after that, he's not mentioned in the yearbooks as far as participating in forensics or debate class. So here's his the commencement issue of the Oracle, and you can see Earl Warren's picture right here. He's dead center, and there were 16 people in his graduating class. And Earl Warren was a year younger than everyone else. He had advanced a grade when he was in elementary school. But one of the things that Earl Warren Jr. talked about that his dad was very proud of is that Earl Warren, and a lot of folks don't know this, was the lead character in the senior class play. In May 27th of 1908, he was in the play What Became of Parker, and Earl Warren played the role of Fred Parker. But because of his working late and practicing, he came to school late with a group of boys right before graduation, and the principal was going to kick them off the play. And it turned into a big to-do, and eventually the school board reinstated the 3 boys to allow them to participate in the school play. And this is a very rare thing. This is something we didn't know. This was found when an alumni brought her grandmother's yearbook in from 1908, 09, and 10, and this was taped on the inside cover of her Oracle. So these type of social history and academic history help paint a better understanding of what Earl Warren was like. When my students look at the transcripts for Earl Warren and they see his grades are average to above average, they see a reflection of their own life. This is a role model for them here at Bakersfield High School. They can see this could be them, and that's the significance of Earl Warren.